Okay, I'm going to mute everybody for the moment, but we will shortly be starting with 4 excellent speakers. Welcome to the second workshop in this particular theme, focusing on planning and employment issues in relation to public expenditure and public services and public sector production. The existence and strength of the public economy allows it to be used as a vehicle for positive policies aimed at protecting and enhancing the quality of jobs elsewhere in the economy, as well as directly in the economy. Those of you that were in the as well as in the public sector. Those of you who heard the final presentation in the previous workshop will have noted Zico's distinction between the direct, the employment enabling function of the public sector doesn't seem to work so well, and we need to pay more attention to the direct employment producing role of the public sector. This workshop is going to look partly at both areas, and so we're going to be looking, firstly, we're going to be hearing a presentation about the remarkable job public works program and jobs guarantee scheme in India, the MGNREGA. We're then going to hear from Daniel Haim, who's going to be talking about the arguments for job guarantees and useful work, which will have obvious relevance for employment functions in the public sector. We're then going to hear very interestingly from Damaris Muhika of Kenyan TUC, who's developed a argument about the use of universal social protection schemes in order to protect workers and jobs in the informal economy and improve the equality there. And then finally, Professor Aristea Koukiadaki is going to be talking to us about labour clauses in EU employment and other existing ways in which procurement conditions have been and can be used to strengthen employment conditions and quality elsewhere in the economy. So very interesting set of presentations. I'm going to learn from my experience of the previous workshop that I need to be more disciplined with speakers. So I'm going to remind all our speakers at the moment that you have 15 minutes each, and after your 15 minutes, after 13 minutes or so, I'll be expecting you to start winding up. I'm very pleased that we're going to start, as we finished the last session, with a shining contribution from Azim Premji University. We're going to start this workshop with another contribution from Azim Premji University, this time from Satheesha B, who's based with the Centre for Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji, and is going to talk about how MGNREGA, but also how it functioned under COVID as a protection mechanism for employment. So over to you, Satheesha, and you have from now until 15 minutes time to make that presentation. Please share the screen. Thanks very much. It will help if I unmute you, won't it?
So am I audible?
You are unmuted. We can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks, David, for the introduction. And my colleague Raghav also here. He's also co-author of this paper. So first, I'll be talking about the background, context, and some of the preliminary results from the survey. And Raghav will be talking about the effectiveness of NREGA during the COVID time. So this work is still in progress. So we really look forward for your comments and suggestions. So I will start with explain some of the main features of Manrega. So the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of 2005, later is renamed as Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. It creates justiciable right to work by promising 100 days of wage employment in every financial year to all rural households. And this Manrega is a work on demand scheme where a citizen can directly approach the local administration and demand for work. If the administration failed to provide work within 15 days, they are liable to pay unemployment allowance. So the literature on Narega, so they talk about how important Narega in rural economy of India. So it helps in raising reservation wages in rural areas, and also it provides more bargaining power in the labor market, particularly for the marginalized sections of the society and mainly for women. According to our survey data, the average wage rate in Narega ranges from 190 rupees in Bihar to 270 rupees in Karnataka, which is equivalent to $2.5 to $3.5 per day. So another important aspect is it provides a safety net for the vulnerable sections of the society. So in this paper, we mainly focusing on this safety net aspects of the Manrega. And also it creates an enhanced rural asset, particularly in agriculture sector like extension of irrigation, etc. So when coming to the pandemic period, the Narega was an important component of social safety net in India. So we know that COVID-induced lockdowns resulted in loss of income, loss of employment, and millions of migrant workers returned to their villages. And moreover, during this period, there has been a significant rise in the budgetary allocation for this particular program. It's increased from 730 billion Indian rupees to around 1,000 billion rupees. It's around 37% increase in the budgetary allocation for Manrega during the COVID period. But this is just 0.5% of the India's overall GDP. Still is very less. So given this broad background, the main objective of this paper is to understand the welfare effects of public programs during the pandemic. More specifically, what extent did additional employment from Manrega help the household to compensate the income loss? So further, we will also try to provide some explanation for the rationing of work in Narega during the pandemic. So the survey carried out in 4 states, namely Bihar, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. And we covered around 2,000 households in the survey. And in each state, we surveyed 2 blocks. And this list of blocks drawn up where the CSOs are based, mainly the National Consortium of Civil Society Organizations for Manrega are based. And we ranked these blocks based on some performance parameters, which obtained from the Manrega Management Information System. And we selected highest ranking block and lowest ranked block in each state. And in each block, we selected 5 Gram Panchayats randomly. So Gram Panchayat is the lowest administrative unit in India. So they are mainly responsible for implementing Narega. And in each GP, we selected around 50 households randomly. So here important is that in this 50, 35 are active and 15 are inactive households. So what active here means a household is if they worked in the financial year preceding COVID, then it's active household. If they did not work under Narega in the financial preceding COVID, termed as inactive household. So this map shows the regional location of surveyed households. So when coming to the survey reference periods, the pre-COVID reference period was from April 2019 to April 2020, and COVID reference period was from April 20 to April 2021. So it's coincide with the financial year. And the survey was carried out in December 2021. It's a door-to-door interview we have carried out. So now we will come to the main findings of the study. So first we looked at the impact of COVID on incomes. So this table shows the annual household income during the 2019-20, that's pre-COVID year, compared to the COVID period. So if you look at the blocks in Bihar. So the average household income in the pre-COVID year in the highest ranking block was 44,000 rupees, which is roughly equivalent to $570 per year. And household reported that it declined by 53% during the COVID time. And if you look at last column in this particular block, around 87% of the household reported that they incurred loss during the COVID period. So if you look at all the blocks, we can see more than 80% of the household reported that they incurred some loss in income compared during the COVID period compared to pre-COVID period. So now we'll come to the role of NREGA as a safety net. So Ravi will be talking about how well NREGA functioned as safety net during the COVID period.
Thank you, Satheesha. Given this impact on incomes, we then wanted to analyze the safety net function of MNREGA. So that is to ask, to what extent did MNREGA was able to compensate households for their income losses during the COVID year. For this exercise, we consider two different kinds of households separately. Now, the first column is one set of households who worked in MNREGA only during the COVID year, who didn't work in previous years. The second kind of household is one which worked in MNREGA in both the years, both the reference periods. Now, importantly, we also consider this only for those households who had some kind of income loss. Now, for the type 1 household, which is those households who worked only during the COVID year, we calculate the amount of income they lost from regular activities, and that does not include remittances and MNREGA. And then we calculate the ratio of MNREGA earnings in the COVID year and the loss in household income. Now, for instance, if a household lost 5,000 rupees in the COVID year, and they also earned 5,000 rupees through MNREGA in that particular year, this ratio would be 1. Now, this particular table gives us some measures of these ratios. The third column gives us the ratio for the type 1 household, which is households who worked only during COVID. And if you see the highest ranked block in Karnataka, this ratio is 1.65. This means that for every 100 rupees the household lost, the household made 165 rupees through MNREGA. Similarly, the lowest ranked block, households received 0.16. That is the ratio. So they made 16 rupees for every 100 rupees lost. Now, in the first case, in Karnataka, the highest ranked block, the MNREGA has fully compensated for the loss in income. Now, this is only for those households who worked only during COVID. Now, in order to understand the role of safety net for households who worked in both the years, we ask the following question. Did MNREGA earnings increase even as the household continued to lose income from regular activities? So for this, we calculate, which is the second column, which is we calculate the ratio of the change in MNREGA earnings between the 2 years and the loss in household income. So if MNREGA earnings increased even as households lost income, then the program was effective in performing its role as a safety net. Now, if the ratio is close to 1, the loss was entirely made up by the MNREGA earnings. Now, if you see in the fourth column for the state of Bihar, the highest ranked block has 1.39 and the lowest ranked block has 0.18. Now, this means that in the highest ranked block, the program was effective. The program also fully compensated for the income loss. In the lowest ranked block in Bihar, the MNREGA earnings did increase even as the household lost income, but it did not compensate. It only compensated 1/5 of the household, the amount of income the household lost. Now, this clearly shows that that the safety net function in Bihar was served better in the highest ranked block than in the lowest ranked block. And the stars, the asterisks in the fourth column also indicate that those particular blocks, Manrega earnings declined as the household lost income. So there was no role of any safety net through Manrega. Now, given this safety net, it's also important to understand what happens to those households who do not work in Manrega as well. Now, Manrega has a history of exclusion, various kinds of exclusion, which happens when a household does not get the job card, when the household does not have a bank account, it does not have a unique identification number, which is known as the Aadhaar card. So various kinds of exclusions have been there for a very long time. Now, for this purpose of this research, we only consider two kinds of exclusion or rationing, which occurs where a Manrega job card holding household does not get work completely, like it gets completely rationed out of Manrega, or it does not get the demanded number of work days under the program. So in that case, the household would have worked for a few days, but did not receive, it did not work for the required number of days. The type 1 is when the entire household gets rationed out of Manrega work, and the type 2 is when the household gets some work days, but that is not adequate. It's important to note that if a worker household is not able to get work, they're also eligible for unemployment allowance. Now this block, this table shows us the share of households which were rationed out completely. The third column shows us the share of households who were rationed out completely among those households who were already active, who were already working in Manrega in the previous year. And this varies between 8% in the highest block in Karnataka to almost 72% in the lowest ranked block of Bihar. While this is very important, the fourth column poses an even graver concern. The fourth column shows us the share of households who did not work in the pre-COVID period as well, but who got rationed out of Manrega during COVID as well. This points to persistent exclusion, and this requires some more investigation. And we are also looking at some kind of regressions to understand what explains this rationing, who gets rationed out, are there any household characteristics that explain rationing, and that's about it. The second type of rationing is in absolute terms, is for those households which worked at least one day, but they did not get the required number of days. On an average, this varies between 48 in the highest block of Karnataka to almost 80 in the lowest ranked block of Bihar. 80 additional days a household on an average would have liked to work for. The fourth column shows us that greater than 95% of households reported that they did not get the required number of days. We also asked Narega workers what they thought, what in their view were some of the reasons why this rationing was occurring. According to them, the major reason was that the adequate number of works were not planned at the panchayat level. This, in their view, did not result in enough person days for them. The second major reason has to do with no information from the contractor. Although, as Satheesha pointed out, the central implementing agency for this program is the Gram Panchayat, but often we find that contractors take over and there are lots of malfeasance as well. To conclude, earnings from Manrega formed an important part of an average Manrega working household. Households who have regularly worked in Manrega derive a significant share of their income from the program. And in the COVID year, barring some blocks, Manrega earnings increased during COVID. This is likely due to increased budgetary outlays as part of the COVID relief program. However, in many cases, as we saw, that the safety net function was not complete, in the sense that Manrega was able to only partially compensate for incomes lost in other activities. Manrega continues to be affected by several other problems related to rationing, high unmet demand, wage delays, and other kinds of malfeasance as well. But this is particularly important as many of these reasons have a compounding effect on the worker finally deciding to opt out of the safety net as well. Some of the potential areas for further work is that, as we've seen in the COVID period, a higher budgetary allocation does lead to a positive effect on overall work days and overall welfare effects. But also, a higher budgetary allocation is not enough as it also needs to be accompanied by a good shelf of works. And by this, I mean that a greater amount of works need to be planned, and this needs greater degree of dovetailing with other government departments such as the agriculture, the irrigation departments, and so on. And finally, at heart, Manrega is a demand-driven program. And for this, the workers need to be active, the workers need to raise their demands, and in many states, we find that the awareness with respect to these issues are very low. And for that, a major role for trade unions and grassroots organizations is to carry out these awareness campaigns for Manrega workers and generally workers in the informal workforce to be a greater part of this social net program. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed, both of you. Can I just ask one simple question with a single figure answer? Just to give people a sense of this, can you tell us roughly how many people have been employed under Manrega last year, the year before, in terms of millions of people?
It's a share of total workforce.
No, like in absolute numbers.
Okay. That we have to check.
I'm afraid we're not able to give that number at the moment, but we should definitely like to get back on this. So.
Okay, terrific. I mean, my memory from the last time I looked at it was it's up in the area of 30 million or more, which I just want other people to get a sense of exactly how big this is as a program, both in terms of its role in the economy as a whole and its impact on employment issues. Okay, thanks very much indeed, both of you. We're now moving on to the next presentation, which is from Daniel Haim. Daniel's at Vienna University of Economics and Business. And he's written some very interesting things about job guarantee schemes and useful work. And he's going to be giving us a presentation from it right now. And here it is starting on the screen. Okay, it's up over to you, Daniel, and you have 15 minutes too. Thank you. Are you... okay, if I unmute you, that'll make it easier, won't it? Okay, I think
you can hear me now, right?
Yeah, we can.
Perfect. And you can see also my presentation?
We can.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for the invite. My name is Daniel Haim. I'm a PhD candidate at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, but I also spent the last 2 years at Levy Economics Institute working on different public employment programs, which we've heard a lot about. My talk will be more on the theoretical side. I'm looking at the writings of Hyman Minsky and what we can learn from his writings about what types of jobs a public job guarantee should provide. Briefly, sort of the key takeaways from my talk. Minsky built his case for the job guarantee on both moral and economic foundations. And through his writings, you can identify sort of 4 important aspects of what types of jobs a job guarantee should provide. It should be jobs that increase socially useful output, providing all of society better public services and goods. Public job guarantee jobs should be guaranteed by the public sector at a minimum wage. They should be in places where people need them and take the unemployed as they are and as they come. A job guarantee can be combined with other social objectives. Obviously, I'll come back to that in my last slide. One note on nomenclatura, Minsky never used the term job guarantee. He usually used the term employer of last resort. He also used the term tap employer, like a water tap that you turn on or off, guaranteed job programs, infinitely elastic demand for labor created by government, or sometimes he just used the US New Deal program synonymously with the term job guarantee. My paper is built on the writings of Minsky that you can access publicly at the Hyman P. Minsky archive that is hosted by Bard College. And I put the link at the bottom of my presentation. If you get the presentation, you can access the archive yourself if you're interested. For those who don't know Hyman P. Minsky, he was a US economist, born 1919, lived until 1996. Schumpeter was his doctoral advisor, which is why he always was very interested in innovations in especially the financial sector and his analysis of the economy. He went to the University of Chicago sort of before the neoliberal Chicago boys took over, and he's a self-described fundamental Keynesian, or you could also say a financial Keynesian or post-Keynesian. He started working on the job guarantee in the 1960s when he worked as a labor economist in Berkeley. He's most famous for his financial instability hypothesis and sort of the analysis that stability within capitalism leads inherently to instability, which is why you need certain measures put in place to deal with that instability. And in his later years, he also looked at different stages of capitalism and analyzed what we now call neoliberalism as money manager capitalism. So he also had a very broad macro view on the economy. I'm focusing on his sort of moral and economic arguments why he thought job guarantees are in order and what kind of job guarantees we should think of. And I'll show you a few excerpts from his writings because I think he speaks for himself, right? So this is an interesting piece I found on a workshop he held on ethics and economics. And that's already lays out the program he's sort of puts forward. He writes, an ethical foundation of the New Deal version of state capitalism follows from 1, no one will starve in America. That's sort of the moral obligation the US has. And B, a dole is anathema, a bad thing. So dole is the common word for unemployment benefits. Unemployment benefits are a bad thing, generally seen by the public. A and B therefore imply, and here he lists 3 famous programs from the New Deal of the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration, the National Youth Administration, and the Civilian Conservation Corps as the foundation stones of macroeconomic policy. He sort of bases this analysis on his idea that the war on poverty that the US sort of fought starting in the 1960s under John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson was flawed. He thought that to fight poverty, you first and foremost need to provide jobs, not welfare. He wrote that there's no better cure for poverty than family income, especially family income earned on a job. So as you can already see, he was an economist with a moral framework behind his writings. I think something that we very often miss nowadays when we read economics papers, that it's not embedded in a more broader moral framework. Another sort of piece of writing that speaks to that is he wrote a paper in 1986 on Labor Day, on May Day, May 1st, and wrote that the essential radical view is that work is a good thing and that chronic mass unemployment is a flaw of the economic order, not a flaw of the unemployed. Work is a public good, for only if work is available does a human achieve the dignity and self-respect that makes a person a good citizen. So here you can already see he sort of what later became the norm in the sort of regulation of unemployment relations, how public employment service offices view the unemployed. He already foresaw and foreshadowed in the 1980s that very often we see the flaw of unemployment within the unemployed persons themselves, that they made poor choices, for example, didn't invest in their education. Minsky says, no, that's not true. The problem is we don't have enough jobs. And he mentioned that full employment is a social and economic good, that transfer payments have a certain stigma, can be demeaning for some household members, and to increase social justice, you need to provide enough jobs. At the same time, he was very clear that these jobs should be provided on a voluntary basis, right? We are not talking about forced labor. He wrote in a paper in 1965, saying adults should be free to choose poverty. So they can deny, if they are offered a job, but no one should have poverty thrust upon him by not having enough jobs within an economy. So you should always provide the opportunity to work at the minimum wage, and that he saw that as sort of a civil standard of an open liberal society. Now, coming to his economic arguments, his opus magnum was published in 1986. It's called Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. It's a very good read that I recommend highly to anyone interested in Keynesian economics, or anyone who's interested in sort of that strand of heterodox economic thought. His background was one of where he viewed neoclassical economics as more of a Smithian view of the economy, to going back to Adam Smith, sort of the invisible hand argument, versus a Keynesian view of the economy. His Keynesian view was that financial crises are endogenous in capitalism due to certain decisions made in the investment and financing process. That's where his financial instability hypotheses come from, and that there are fundamental flaws of capitalism. Two of them already identified by Keynes, namely unemployment and inequality. And the third fundamental flaw that he identified was instability. He was very skeptical of fine-tuning the economy through aggregate demand management, right? So if we think about Keynesian economics, we think about there's a recession and then government has to step in and fill that gap mechanically. And Minsky was very skeptical that that could work. He did not think that governments could target that well enough. In addition, he also thought that the aggregate demand management tools available to government in the 70s and 80s were flawed also because at the direction of the investment, especially in the US, we're talking about the Cold War in the 1980s. This has meant military Keynesianism, investing a lot in military capacities. In the 60s, when he was writing, a lot of public investment went into what he called space adventures, right? So the race to get to the moon. Now, Maria Mazzucato would have to say something different about how the spillover effects of certain programs are beneficial to all of society. Minsky was more skeptical if the average citizen benefits from space adventurism and military Keynesianism. In his opus magnum, he then wrote sort of the foundational economic argument for job guarantee, which is the policy problem that we face, especially in the 80s when Fordist capitalism sort of started breaking down, is to develop a strategy for full employment that does not lead to instability, inflation, and unemployment. The main instrument of such a policy, in his mind, was the creation of an infinitely elastic demand for labor at a floor or minimum wage that does not depend upon long and short-run profit expectations of business. Since only government can divorce the offering of employment from the profitability of hiring workers, the infinitely elastic demand for labor must be created by government. Now, infinitely elastic demand for labor, as I mentioned before, basically means insert here job guarantee, because it means every unemployed person has a job offered by the government. The employment programs, and this is, I think, an important aspect, are to be permanent, operating at a base level during good times and expanding during recessions. So he thought even if you're in a boom phase, you always have a certain share of the unemployed that cannot be employed through sort of private sector initiatives or private sector job growth. He saw big government, as he called it, as an automatic stabilizer that helps in all stages of the business cycle. Now, I already mentioned that he thought that jobs need to produce socially useful output. He criticized military spending. He also thought that this was a good idea to help with poverty overall. If you provide jobs that are good for the communities and the municipalities, you help against poverty, where he wrote about poverty in the US stems as much, if not more, from shortcomings in communal services as from a shortfall in private income. if we make adequate communal consumption available to all, much of the burden of poverty can be eased. So the jobs he had in mind were supplementary labor to schools, to hospitals, to park systems, providing care, building public facilities like swimming pools, tennis courts, etc., where he was inspired by the New Deal programs. And I brought along a few posters from the New Deal programs that sort of reiterate the types of jobs that the New Deal programs created, like improving state parks for recreation, improving certain sport facilities across the country, planting 2 billion trees with the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 30s. He also thought that these jobs have to be offered by different levels of government, and he had the idea that government agencies would be bidding for labor by submitting their projects, and local evaluation boards would determine priorities among projects. I mean, this has happened and actually implemented public employment programs also in the 2000s. If you think about the job guarantee in Argentina, or the heads of households program in Argentina from 2002 to 2009. He also mentioned that full employment requires special employment programs of all levels of government. So the local municipal level is one, but maybe you also need special programs, for example, for the youth or for certain target groups. And here again, you can see a poster from the National Youth Administration that showed sort of the variety of different jobs. He also mentioned that jobs need to be in places where people need them. If you do that, if you're successful, then an employer of last resort willing and able to hire all who opt to work will have a large impact on poorer rural areas. And one of the effects of such a national employment policy will be to slow down the pace of migration to the urban complexes that he already saw happening in the 1960s. Urbanization processes have, of course, progressed since then, but I think this is applicable to all types of public employment programs. You try to create the offering of jobs or the offer of jobs at places where people are, and don't force them to move across the country for certain projects that you initiate. And finally, taking people as they are means, I think this is, for me at least, one of the most important and influential quotes that you can, or readings from Minsky that you should take away from my presentation today. He wrote that programs must be designed which hold out a promise of a useful and productive life for our high school dropouts. So it doesn't really make sense to put them in educational or training programs. You need to offer certain jobs at a minimum wage that allows them to participate socially and protect themselves from poverty. For this idea to be realized, we thought about breaking down jobs into simpler jobs. Take a certain job that you have in mind, and then maybe breaking it down into simpler tasks, and also sort of give leeway to have people work at their own speed or work with the skills they bring along. In addition, he thought it would be interesting to increase access to community college in the US, but that is only an additional measure. So to sum up, what can we learn from Minsky today? One thing he had in mind, or one thing he always stressed in the 1990s, shortly before he died, is he wrote that the problem of discovering and putting in place institutions of a successful capitalism cannot be solved once and for all. So there is no one size fits all. You need to think about what you want to achieve with your public employment programs and adapt to any situation that you face. Job guarantees serve as an automatic stabilizer, decreases macroeconomic instability. You can use public employment programs in your fight against poverty from two sides. First, of course, income stabilization that we also just heard in the very interesting previous presentation, but also the improved and expanded access to municipal services. You include those that are previously left behind. Now, Minsky mentioned high school dropouts, but in today's economy, we can also think about, or in today's society, as job guarantees as potential paths to citizenships for migrants and refugees. If you think about certain target groups, long-term unemployed or people with disabilities, for example, that should be included in the regular labor market as well to have an inclusive economy. Minsky did not write a lot about democratic bottom-up approaches, except that projects should be developed locally. But of course, this is an aspect that we should incorporate today, sort of increase social cohesion by developing projects locally and democratically. And lastly, I think you can implement job guarantees in a broader framework with your other economic and social objectives. in your fight against multiple crises that we face today. This could be the climate crisis, the care crisis, COVID. You can use job guarantee to distribute medicine or food during lockdowns, or also now what we face, impoverishment through inflation, where I think a job guarantee is a important policy tool and a toolkit that we can use. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Daniel, thanks very much. And thanks very much for keeping pretty much bang on time as well. Very interesting presentation, especially following on from something from Manrega. I mean, looking at that last slide, one suspects that those who designed Manrega had read a bit of Minsky on the role and nature of job guarantee schemes. Okay, I'm now going to ask Damaris Muhika to make the next presentation. Damaris, if you like to unmute yourself. And while you're doing that, perhaps I can introduce you as someone who's works for the Central Organization of Trade Unions of Kenya, but you're also a PhD candidate yourself, and you've written a very interesting paper about universal social protection for the informal economy, and so I very much look forward to your presentation on this subject. So please, Damaris, we're very much looking forward to hearing from you, and if you can unmute yourself, that will be excellent. Very good. If you want to share the presentation, please do so.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you, everyone. I'm not able to share my presentation. I had shared with Nadia. My assumption was that I would be able to be assisted. So my name is Damaris. Yes, I represent workers' organizations, work with trade unions. I'm very passionate about social protection coverage, and especially coverage of the informal economy workers who have been left behind. And just to mention that our position as trade unions is that social protection is a fundamental human right, and it's not a political privilege as many in Africa perceive it. It's not a political pronouncement. And in Kenya, the Constitution has provided that social protection is a right, and that every person has the right to social security. And it has committed government to provide appropriate social security to persons who are unable to support themselves and their dependents. We have an economic blueprint as a country towards year 2030. We call it Kenya Vision 2030. And the blueprint describes what quality of life should be for all citizens towards year 2030. And in the country, we have adopted a life cycle approach to social protection so that in every stage of life, any social protection benefits can be provided to cushion people and citizens from any form of shock. And we are familiar that in sub-Saharan countries, we have an extreme age dependency rate. Currently, a study conducted by the World Bank estimated our dependency rate in sub-Saharan Africa to be at 76%. And in Kenya, the same is reported to be at 81%. And therefore, any social protection benefit across the life cycle, whether it's a sickness benefit, a child benefit, or an old age benefit, goes a long way to lessen the strain that is, or the burden on the working population. And this was more exposed during the COVID crisis, where the social protection gap was really revealed. When you look at the SDG target number 1.3, which calls for universal social protection, the target aspires to provide social protection not only as an effective strategy in advancing social justice, human capital development, but also we can go a long way to reduce poverty and exclusion, and also reduce inequality. And in 20
Damaris, you seem to have muted yourself again. Okay.
Sorry for that. And I was saying that the SDG target 1.3 describes social protection as an effective strategy for advancing social justice. It can go a long way to build human capital and reduce poverty, reduce exclusion, and also promote equity. In 2019, members of the ILO and all the social partners, that is employers, workers' representatives, and governments, committed to increase or to enhance social protection to a universal level by year 2030. And in Africa, currently, social protection coverage is at 17.8%, which was recorded in 2019. But we are aspiring in Africa to reach 40% by year 2025, and to have in universal social protection coverage by year 2030. However, we need to note that achievement of universal social protection calls for increased investment, and especially public investment into social protection systems. And also, we need also to note that sustainability and fairness of social protection systems require prioritizing reliable and equitable forms of domestic financing that should be complemented with international cooperation and support where it is necessary. So what is the level of investment in social protection currently in Africa, in East Africa, and in Kenya? Various studies have established that the average public investment into social protection system in Africa is less than 5% compared to the global average of 12.9%. And most of these social protection programs, and especially cash transfer programs, are overly dependent on external funding, that is donor funding. Kenya in particular, we invest about 0.1% of our GDP into the social protection sector. But we aspire by year 2030 to reach an investment of 3% of our GDP. Currently, our social protection coverage has 3 pillars. That is social insurance. We have social health protection benefit, and we have social assistance or cash transfers. But they are barely, the average social protection coverage is about 22% of the citizenry. So we have a long way to go. And it's notable that the current coverage has excluded the informal economy workers. And this is a concern to the trade unions in Kenya. Because the reason why, one of the key reasons why the informal economy workers have been left behind in the social protection system is because of inadequate incomes. They are too, for instance, they are too poor to afford contributory social insurance schemes. And therefore, our current advocacy is around increasing social protection coverage to these particular workers who have been left behind. And how have we proposed as trade unions to increase social protection coverage to the informal economy workers? We are advocating for increased government investment. And we have committed the government through national economic plans, like what I've just mentioned, the Vision 2030. We also have medium-term plans that have a 5-year cycle. And in our advocacy, we have also proposed to government how we can enhance our physical space. One, by formalizing the informal sector, which currently stands at about 85% of the labor force. And formalization of the small, medium, and micro enterprises is one of the strategies that of increasing the tax base. And therefore, the country can have an enhanced physical space. However, it's very important to note that expansion of the tax base into the informal economy, or bringing the informal economy workers into the tax system, is only successful whenever there's a physical exchange where we can hold government to account for every cent that the taxpayers have contributed through a social contract. The second proposal on increasing the physical space is by sealing illicit financial flows and corruption. I give an example, and this is public knowledge, that the other day the government was put to account for about 2 billion Kenya shillings that the country loses through illicit financial flows and corruption daily. Enough money that can establish and enhance social protection coverage to those that has been left behind. We have also proposed that it's very important to have to include social partners into governance structures of the social protection institutions, because we are promoters of social dialogue, and it has been proved that whenever there is inclusion of all the social partners in the governance structures, there is an improvement of accountability and transparency in the social protection institutions. So some of the lessons that we have learned as trade unions in Kenya while advocating for extension of social protection coverage is that social dialogue is very critical. It is an element, it's a critical element while designing and implementing social protection system. And that inclusion of all social partners build trust and increases buy-in. In brief, that is my presentation. Those are our sentiments and proposals for enhancing social protection investment by various countries in Africa, and particularly in Kenya. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Damaris. Very illuminating, and especially interesting that you end up with including their clear proposals to close the financial gap by formalizing the informal economy, and with the additional benefit of expanding the tax base, which is also highly relevant to what we're talking about. So thanks very much indeed for that. And now to our final speaker, Professor Andrea Koukiadaki from University of Manchester. She's Professor of Labour Law and Industrial Relations, and she's going to be talking to us. She works for the European Trade Union Institute as well, and is on the committee of the Institute of Employment Rights in the UK. And she's going to be talking to us about labour clauses in EU procurement and other use of procurement rules to create employment and regulate the quality of employment throughout the economy. So Andrea, thanks very much for agreeing to speak, and please, Aristea, please, over to you, and please share your screen if you want to make a presentation. Thanks very much indeed. 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, and David, and it's great to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. So as you explained, I'm going to discuss about the issue of public procurement and labor clauses. I have been working on this particular topic during the recent 3 years or so. We had a project that was looking at the use of procurement for the purpose of promoting decent work in England, and we recently started another project on again the use of procurement in respect of decent work in 2 specific sectors, in cleaning and security. But for the purpose of this presentation, I thought, as we discussed, that it would be good maybe to consider the broader developments when it comes to the use of procurement in labor, and consider also the specific case of the EU and the ILO framework as well. So, of course, before proceeding, I think it's important to, of course, to consider, first of all, our understanding and reflect upon our understanding about the relationship between public procurement and labor clauses. So, of course, public procurement, which is, of course, the purchasing by governments, but also local authorities, so public and central and local governments, the purchasing from private sector contractors on the base of competitive bidding, is one of the main sources of public spending. So, for instance, in the context of the EU, it has been calculated that public procurement makes up of around 15 or 20% of the global GDP, and it's around 12% of GDP in the context of the OECD countries. So it's in light of its economic significance, it's not surprising, of course, to find that governments have often used this power as buyers as a tool to advance public policy objectives. This, of course, hasn't been actually always met with consent in this respect. So we have kind of different views on the ways, or on the basically on the underlying, let's say, rationale for using procurement as a means to promote social or other types of public policy objectives, or whether, I guess, we shouldn't be doing that in the first place. So in the context of labor policies, of course, a kind of a generally supportive view of the use of procurement has been developed in the context of this idea of socially responsible procurement. So there is, of course, a kind of a very significant and interesting debate that seeks to promote this idea that procurement should actually seek to incorporate other kind of non-market, let's say, considerations, because, of course, of the importance, as we said, of the state as a buyer, and because, of course, of the significance that it has in terms of influencing standards. There is a counter view, and that I think has been quite influential at different points in time for different reasons, but this essentially kind of advocates that it shouldn't be, procurement shouldn't be used to advance other non-market goals, and that these goals basically will come as a result of the natural kind of operation of the efficient, I guess, a market hypothesis in the procurement market as well. If we accept, though, that there is a scope to use procurement to advance social goals and specifically, of course, labor. In this case, there are two main considerations, two main objectives behind using procurement. So the first kind of generally accepted objective is to remove essentially labor costs as a source of competition between the bidders that, of course, compete for those public contracts. So I think it is quite, let's say, common in legislation or other kind of forms of intervention to find or to come across these types of justifications. The second justification for incorporating labor clauses in procurement is basically to ensure also that public contracts do not exert this type of downward pressure on labor more widely. So that, of course, could be the case in terms of the private sector as well. So if we then agree that there is scope and there is a normative, let's say, understanding around the need to use procurement as a way to promote labor clauses, then there are different ways of doing that from a regulatory point of view. There are three ways to distinguish policies that seek to promote those horizontal labor clauses in procurement. And one main distinction is between policies that seek to secure compliance with general legal requirements and vis-a-vis, let's say, policies that go beyond legal compliance. So to give an example, we may, for instance, find legislation or, like, of course, contracting authorities that will require compliance with minimum wage legislation that is set out in statute, and that can be contrasted to policies that go beyond compliance. So, for instance, local authorities or public authorities more generally requiring compliance with a living wage. That, of course, like, that's quite common in the UK, that is not legally mandated. The second distinction is in terms of policies that are concerned only with the contract performance. So they are only concerned with that aspect of work or services that are tendered vis-a-vis other kind of policies that seek basically to promote specific labor standards across the whole organization. So not only in respect of workers that provide that service, that work for the public contract. And then again, another kind of distinction is, of course, like in terms of different mechanisms to promote those horizontal policies, those policies that relate, of course, among others, to labor issues. So in some cases, we find examples of so-called set-asides, where contracts are reserved for specific groups in the first place. In some other cases, that is actually quite common, especially when it comes to labor clauses that relate to fair work, to dimensions of fair work in terms of wages, in terms of, for instance, the use of non-standard forms of employment, is through the so-called award criteria. So these criteria basically may be reflecting specific labor considerations, as I said, for instance, like the use, or of course the avoidance of use of 0 hours contracts, or like the requirement to pay the living wage, etc. And then there are also contract performance clauses that are basically inserted in the contract between the public client, the public authority, and the private contractors. So horizontal policies of this kind, especially when it comes to the labor field, are, of course, increasingly actually extensively regulated in the context of the WTO, but also, as we're going to see, in the context of the EU. But of course, from the perspective of labor standards in particular, what is, of course, of prime interest is the regulation of those issues at the ILO level. So in the context of the ILO, the most prominent example is ILO Convention 94 that was adopted in 49, And basically it requires, so it doesn't introduce new standards as such for the member states, but it basically stipulated the requirement to apply effectively existing standards in public contracts through, as I've said before, this specific mechanism of the so-called contract performance clauses. So we can see here that, like, together with ILO the ILO recommendation 94, the objective is to ensure that workers of course, like that provide their work in those public contracts are entitled to wages, hours of work, and other labor conditions at least as good as those normally observed for the kind of work in question in the area where the contract is executed, but also ensure that higher local standards, if of course they are available, are applied. The other distinctive element of the Labor Clauses Convention is that the scope of its application is extended in terms of the sectors, but it's also extended in terms of those requirements that have to be applied to subcontractors as well. And of course, in the case of public procurement, as in the case of private, we may have lots of times complex chains of contracting that of course make it even harder to assess compliance and to monitor essentially for compliance, and of course like promote compliance and basically the implementation of those standards throughout the supply chain. There have been though problems with the ILO Convention 94. There was an assessment by basically the ILO Committee of Experts in 2008, and there were a number of challenges that were identified in respect of ILO Convention. One of the main challenges was, of course, the fact that it hasn't been ratified by many member states of the ILO. So I think at the moment, I think there are around 70 states that have ratified the convention. The UK actually is an interesting case because the UK provided in some ways the kind of the example in the first place for the adoption of the convention, because the convention itself relied on the fair work, fair wage legislation that was then in existence in the UK, but in the 80s, the UK denounced the convention. But as I've said, for the time being, the convention actually hasn't been very, I think, well, it hasn't been supported in terms of like the number of ratifications. There seems to be also, or there was at the time when the ILO Committee of Experts assessed the convention, there was some concern about the lack of support for special protection of workers working in public contracts. But of course, like at the same time, we have seen, I think, in more recent years, significant and growing pressure to apply labor standards in public contracts. So if we move then to the question of how labor issues are regulated in public procurement, again, I think what the EU kind of story or the EU developments seem to suggest is that we have seen a kind of like, I guess, like very interesting, I would say, developments when it comes to the regulatory kind of dimension of incorporating social clauses and labor clauses in procurement, and basically the underlying, let's say, justifications for doing that or for limiting it to the other extreme, of course. So in the context, of course, of the EU, we have a complex regulatory framework that is based on the EU primary law, the treaties. We have specific legislation that deals with EU procurement in particular. And then, of course, we have the EU kind of labor law aspect that intersects with, of course, procurement legislation. So up until a certain point, there was, I would say, a general presumption of regulatory complementarity between the EU market integration rules that were, of course, promoted through procurement, and the practice of incorporating labor clauses, labor standards in public procurement. There were some kind of disagreements in terms of like when to incorporate that, but as I said, like I think in principle it was accepted that things could actually work in complementary ways. That though kind of that assumption I think was significantly challenged by case law by the Court of Justice of the European Union. The most significant case here, and I know that maybe I don't have lots of time, is the case of Rufert, where basically the Court of Justice of the European Union found that a requirement to comply with local collective agreements in a particular state in Germany was not compliant with EU primary and secondary law. Since then, we have seen some, I think, like reaction to that case law by the Court of Justice that I think seems to suggest a more labor-friendly understanding of how to use procurement. So we have new directives at the EU level, but then we have also institutional and organizational experimentation at the national level. So we could talk here about legislation in Finland, in Sweden and Spain that tries basically to use procurement in more inventive ways to promote labor clauses. And then we have also, of course, like the UK has exited the EU, but even before Brexit, we had very interesting coalitions and movements in order to promote living wage clauses in public procurement. So to conclude, I think, as I've said, as I've tried to highlight, I think like the history of incorporating procurement or incorporating social clause in procurement, I think is could be characterized by significant changes. Of course, if we look at it from the perspective of a longer kind of time period, there are, I think, significant contradictions in terms of the state acting as a regulator and as a buyer. At the same time, I think it is important, I think, to emphasize the significant role that procurement can play in terms of advancing, preserving, but also promoting labor standards. But at the same time, I think it is also important to understand that there are limits to procurement. So it is a very useful and a very good tool, but I think it's also important to recognize that it's also kind of an insufficient tool to deal with all types of labor abuses and decent work deficits, of course, that exist in the world of labor today. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Terrific. Aristea, thanks very much indeed, and thanks for keeping pretty much to time as well. Okay, then we're open for discussion, and if people want to raise a point, make a point, or ask a question, please raise your hand using the reactions button. And you can raise questions and points in relation to any of the contributions or all of them. Just in terms of starting, I don't know if any of the contributors want to come back and raise further comments and questions about each other's presentations, as it were, and the relation between them. There's already been, for example, I mean, some clear connections between what Daniel Haim was saying about Minsky and what Satheesha and colleague were saying about Rega, and also what Damaris was saying in terms of the moving the ambitions of the Kenyan trade unions towards attempting to formalize the informal economy, as well as using social support to support migrant workers in particular. Perhaps I can start by asking if I can ask Aristea perhaps to just comment a bit more about an episode she mentioned, which I remember quite specifically, which was the UK specifically denouncing ILO 94, to which it was committed, previously committed, i.e. that government contractors had to pay the standard conditions and wages as per the public sector itself. And that had been, as you said, a very powerful part of the UK system of industrial relations. And you made the comment about one of the two key objectives of labour clauses of that kind being to prevent wages from being an arena for competition between contractors. Can you just say a bit more about that in respect of two things? Firstly, that I think what we saw there was how, once again, how neoliberal regimes can be very strategic in pursuing exactly the opposite objectives. I mean, the very precise reason for denouncing ILO 94 was precisely to allow and indeed encourage contractors to compete over wages with the objective of driving down wages in the economy in general. The second question I wanted to ask you about that was in relation to something that in the first workshop, Olivia Herdeman made mention of, that one of the powerful forms of enforcement of marketization in the EU is the complaint system, whereby companies can very quickly and easily get the European Commission to jump on people that the companies think are breaking marketization things. And that was one of the very powerful things about ILO 94 or fair wages resolution. It meant that if a contractor was seen to be underpaying, it wasn't just down to the local workers or local union to try and bring the contractor into line. They could contact the government department and say, it's not delivering in accordance. The government department would then say to the contractor, you have to demonstrate that you are complying or you don't get more contracts. So those two questions really, firstly, that we're talking about counter strategies in two directions, and secondly, the importance of enforcement mechanisms. Sorry, I thought you were still unmuted.
Thank you. I muted myself, but thank you. No, I think yeah, both issues that you raised are of course very important when it comes to the first issue in terms of the UK denouncing labor ILO Convention 94. From what I understand, of course, I think it has to be seen in the wider context of the conservative governments at that time, policies and priorities when it comes to essentially dismantling, I think we could say, institutions that related to the labor market, and I think in this respect denouncing ILO Convention 94 was part and parcel of that approach of I guess liberalizing the employment relations system through attacking also, of course, the requirement of public contractors to, of clients to apply and contractors, of course, to comply with those standards that could be included in collective agreements, in other kind of sources of regulation. So I think, yes, I think it has to be seen in the wider context of liberalization, neoliberalization by the UK government. So in that context, of course, wages were seen as a cost. And wages were also, I think, like seen as, of course, like a kind of a perfectly legitimate kind of dimension for competitiveness. Yeah, so I think that it has to be seen in that kind of light. And then in terms of like the function, I think, of ILO convention, I think yes, like I think it's a very interesting instrument, both in terms of the requirements that it sets out, in terms of, like, as I said, like it doesn't introduce new standards, but it requires compliance with existing standards. But I think also it was quite significant in terms of the specific provisions when it comes to sanctions and remedies. So it specifically provided for instance, the possibility for contractors to be dropped like from that a particular kind of contract if they were found to be non-compliant. And going back to what I discussed earlier, what I said about the current work that we are doing in procurement, what we have found so far from our case studies in the UK is that there seems to be a dissonance in some respects between public authorities and contractors agreeing in the procurement process to incorporate specific social clause in procurement, but then actually kind of like when we look into how those are implemented in practice, it seems that like there is significant, I would say, there are significant challenges when it comes to those clauses, whether they are incorporated in the contract in the first place, if they are incorporated, how they are enforced. I think there is a problem of monitoring, and that has to do with resources. It has to do with whether they are incorporated, as I said, in the first place in the contract or not. And it has to do also with of course, like the propensity, let's say, of public authorities to enforce any clauses that may be there. And of course, like, well, other kind of issues that relate to the chain, as I've described earlier, of the long chain of subcontracting and the problems of transparency, the problems of trade unions, how they are involved, etc. So, yeah, I guess what I would like to say is that, yeah, I think there are ways to incorporate social clauses, but I think a very big issue and a very big question is how then those social clauses are actually promoted in the contracts, yeah, and complied with.
Okay, very interesting, very helpful in that. Okay, well, I'm enjoying myself here because I'm getting to ask lots of the questions. But my next question really it's for both Daniel and Satheesha. Perhaps Satheesha to start with, and then Daniel. In relation both to the general Minsky arguments for job guarantee schemes and the actual way MGen-Reagan operates, if in effect, both with MGen-Reagan and with the Minsky schemes, it's expected there will be some base level of number of jobs supported by these schemes in the good times for economies, as it were, and it will then rise as a kind of automatic stabilizer, which is really just what Satheesha and colleague were talking about in terms of COVID in the bad times. But it's geared to publicly useful production of services, the creation of public infrastructure assets, etc., and the very clear mechanisms in MREGA for the determination of such projects. At what point do we draw the boundary between saying this kind of a certain kind of activity should be the subject of intrinsically temporary work guarantee schemes, and saying, look, these projects, this kind of work is actually ongoing required for the production of commonly consumed services which are important in themselves for eliminating poverty, that kind of argument? why don't we simply increase the size of public authorities providing these services directly, so that the role of the job guarantee scheme should be reduced to minimal level in good times for the economy. So I don't know, maybe Satheesha and colleague, do you have any thoughts on that in the Indian context? I think there's some discussion about the possibility of extending MGNREGA, and I think also Azim Premji did do some work on the employment arguments for expanding health and education services. Yeah. Sorry, it's another. Everybody's muting themselves too politely. Okay, Satheesha.
Yeah. Now they're planning to extend it to the urban areas also. So the states like Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, or Himachal Pradesh, they already started this kind of public program in urban sector, mainly for the unskilled workers. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I wanted to point out, like, I mean, you pointed out how similar and how similar Daniel's presentation was to us and how connected it was. I mean, it was fascinating. I mean, I'm pretty sure that people who designed Manrega must have borrowed a lot from Minsky. But there's one difference that I just wanted to highlight is that Minsky particularly speaks of an economy which is already at full employment, or which can deviate from full employment in times of recession. But from what I understand, in the Indian economy particularly has still continued to be marked by some kind of underemployment, where there's a large surplus labor sector, which is not getting absorbed in the modern service and manufacturing sectors. So while there's therefore there's a lot of population trapped in the informal sectors, both agriculture and non-agriculture. So therefore, in that sense, I'm not sure if job guarantee, particularly in India, can be limited to be a temporary measure as of now, where in fact, it can play a much larger role in the structural transformation of the economy by playing a huge role in creating productive assets in the rural areas, by which productivity of agriculture can improve, and as a consequence, people can move into better jobs as well. So I think that's a fundamental difference between, say, countries in the global north and the global south. But also, there is a much larger role, as Satheesha also pointed out, in there's a lot of scope for an employment of last resort, not just in rural areas, not just an expansion in rural areas, but also an expansion of this program to urban areas as well. Thanks.
Okay, Daniel.
I think it's a great question that you pose. Before I answer, just a quick reference. Yeah, Minsky, of course, was writing on the context of the US, although he never thought of the US as being at full employment. I mean, he was a fundamental Keynesian in that way, that it is more of the exception that you are at the full employment economy. But of course, we're talking about a much smaller informal sector in the US. I mean, we're talking about a few million underemployed, unemployed people out of the labor force who would like to work. And of course, the size is different. With your question, David, I think it's I think that's sort of at the core of the discussion, right? Is there a threat that job guarantee jobs create sort of a two-class public service system, which we don't want? Can people who are the target groups of employment programs be incorporated in this quote-unquote regular sector, if we think of the regular public sector not following austerity? And yeah, I think to a certain extent, I agree. If the public sector worked more inclusively in incorporating people, then yes, I think there can be mixed forms. We had a public employment program in Austria that helped long-term unemployed people over the age of 55 become sort of employed again at the municipal level. So they became employed by municipalities. So those were not separate projects, but their wages were still paid through this work guarantee scheme. So I think that's a good mixture, especially for countries of the global north, where you have a substantial public sector that might accommodate that. However, you will always have, I think, a base level, as you mentioned it, of people who just have, who are excluded from the regular labor market out of different reasons. Could be health reasons, could be previous addiction, debt problems, could be they were released from prison and no one wants to hire them. So you always have different target groups in your social policy objectives that will have a really hard time, even in the public sector, to be hired, where a job guarantee program can be instituted in a way that addresses the needs of those people. So they might not be measured at the same level of productivity that you would expect from other public employees, but you still offer them the opportunity to become a valuable contribution to a municipality or society.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much for that. I'd come back and ask Damaris to say some more, but I think we've lost her by the look of it. But I'd be very interested I would have asked Damaris to sort of comment on what Aristea was saying in particular about the different varieties of the use of procurement and the potential for using that, and also whether there was potential for developing a Manrega kind of scheme in Kenyan context. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of this workshop. Thanks very much indeed to the speakers. I hope all of you who were in the room with us have enjoyed the presentations. I certainly found them really illuminating, very helpful. Thanks very much indeed. Various people have been asking, will presentations be shared? We hope we will be asking all of you contributors before doing that, obviously, but we hope you'll be willing for us to share these presentations because they're very helpful indeed. So thanks very much indeed. The third workshop on this theme of planning, it starts in half an hour, slightly less, and it will be about the relationship between public services and trade agreements, which run on a different kind of narrative, but we will maintain a certain institutional continuity because we will have an Austrian, a Vienna contributor opening that session by talking about ISDS clauses. So look forward to seeing many of you in half an hour. Thank you.